Welcome, everyone. I'm John Tomasi, the president of Heterodox Academy. We're having an event today, a panel on Let's Talk About Sex, Baby, Why Biological Sex Remains a Necessary Analytical Category in Anthropology. Next slide, please. So this is an event sponsored by Heterodox Academy. We, as the panelists and I, will be following the HxA way, and we encourage and ask you, please, to follow the HxA too and the HxA way in your questions. The way has 5 principles: make your case with evidence, be intellectually charitable, be intellectually humble, be constructive, and of course, don't forget to be yourself. Next, please. If you're not a member of Heterodox Academy, please consider joining us. If you're interested in the ideas of open inquiry and viewpoint diversity and constructive disagreement, and you share our mission of elevating our universities from within, making them the kinds of places that encourage and celebrate the genuine diversity of ideas, please subscribe to our email, follow us on Facebook and on Twitter. Next, please. So why are we here? In March 2023, 5 anthropologists, all women, submitted a panel topic and paper abstracts to the AAA, the American Anthropological Association, and the Canadian Anthropological Association, HxA. They submitted this panel proposals to the general session, and in early July, the AAA and HxA accepted that panel on the scholarly merits. In late July, both organizations posted the preliminary program which included this panel. And then in September 25th, AAA and HxA informed the panelists that their acceptance had been rescinded and that the panel would not be allowed to be conducted at these important annual meetings. The panelists appealed that decision, but the decision was allowed to stand. At HxA, we have goodwill towards all reasonable people, and we have malice towards none. And yet we believe in, and indeed we insist upon, the idea that our university systems be inclusive, that they be research spaces where important ideas are allowed to freely collide, to interact with each other, to cross-pollinate, to germinate, to grow and to change, based on the scholarly merits, not based on political ideas or fashions. At HxA, we insist that our university spaces be inclusive. We believe that the AAA and HxA were wrong to rescind their acceptance of this panel. We believe that they did so for political reasons, not for scholarly reasons. And we think that's a terrible mistake on their part. So HxA is respectfully replatforming this scheduled event. I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then each panelist will speak, and then we'll have comments from Carol Hooven, and then we'll have open discussion with all of you. So our panelists are, first, Kathleen Lowry, who is an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Canada. She has carried out field work on Indigenous communities in the Bolivian and Paraguayan Chaco since the late 1990s, and is currently working on a book about the anthropology of women. Elizabeth Weiss is a professor of anthropology at San Jose State University with a focus on the study of skeletal remains. I'm especially proud to say that Elizabeth is a visiting fellow at the Center for HxA Center for Academic Pluralism, and she's also a board member of the National Association of Scholars. Her latest book, which came out in 2020, is Repatriation and Erasing the Past. Kathleen Richardson is a professor of ethics and culture of robots and AI, and the director of a research group, Women, Ethics, Robots, AI, and Data, at the De Montfort University in Leicester, England. She is the author of An Anthropology of Robots and AI, Annihilation, Anxiety, and Machines, 2015, Challenging Sociality, Attachment, Autism, and Robots, 2018, and co-editor of Asexual Politics of Sex Robots and Sex Dolls, 2023. Michelle Sirois has taught anthropology for more than 9 years. She is currently president of a feminist group that defends women's rights, the PDF in Quebec. Silvia Carrasco is a professor of social anthropology at the Autonomous University of Barcelona, Spain. She has recently coordinated the research and book Co-Education Kidnapped, Feminist Critique of the Penetration of Transgender Ideas in Education, 2022, which is already in its 3rd edition, and the report From Adult Men to Adolescent Girls, a data analysis of referrals to the Catalan Gender Identity Service in public health over the past 10 years. She is also the president of Feministes de Catalunya, Feminists of Catalonia, and the vice president of the Feminist Teachers for Coeducation. And our discussant, as I mentioned a moment ago, is Carol Hooven. Carol is a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise. Welcome, everyone. I'm John Tomasi, the president of Heterodox Academy. We're having an event today, a panel on Let's Talk About Sex, Baby, Why Biological Sex Remains a Necessary Analytical Category in Anthropology. Next slide, please. So this is an event sponsored by Heterodox Academy. We, as the panelists and I, will be following the HxA way, and we encourage and ask you, please, to follow the HxA2 and the HxA way in your questions. The way has 5 principles: make your case with evidence, be intellectually charitable, be intellectually humble, be constructive, and of course, don't forget to be yourself. Next, please. If you're not a member of Heterodox Academy, please consider joining us. If you're interested in the ideas of open inquiry and viewpoint diversity and constructive disagreement, and you share our mission of elevating our universities from within, making them the kinds of places that encourage and celebrate the genuine diversity of ideas, please subscribe to our email, follow us on Facebook and on Twitter. Next, please. So why are we here? In March 2023, 5 anthropologists, all women, submitted a panel topic and paper abstracts to the AAA, the American Anthropological Association, and the Canadian Anthropological Association, HxA. They submitted this panel proposals to the general session, and in early July, the AAA and HxA accepted that panel on the scholarly merits. In late July, both organizations posted the preliminary program which included this panel. And then in September 25th, AAA and HxA informed the panelists that their acceptance had been rescinded and that the panel would not be allowed to be conducted at these important annual meetings. The panelists appealed that decision, but the decision was allowed to stand. At HxA, we have goodwill towards all reasonable people, and we have malice towards none. And yet we believe in, and indeed we insist upon, the idea that our university systems be inclusive, that they be research spaces where important ideas are allowed to freely collide, to interact with each other, to cross-pollinate, to germinate, to grow and to change, based on the scholarly merits, not based on political ideas or fashions. At HxA, we insist that our university spaces be inclusive. We believe that the AAA and HxA were wrong to rescind their acceptance of this panel. We believe that they did so for political reasons, not for scholarly reasons. and we think that's a terrible mistake on their part. So HxA is respectfully replatforming this scheduled event. I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then each panelist will speak, and then we'll have comments from Carol Hooven, and then we'll have open discussion with all of you. So our panelists are, first, Kathleen Lowry, who is an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Canada. She has carried out field work on Indigenous communities in the Bolivian and Paraguayan Chaco since the late 1990s, and is currently working on a book about the anthropology of women. Elizabeth Weiss is a professor of anthropology at San Jose State University with a focus on the study of skeletal remains. I'm especially proud to say that Elizabeth is a visiting fellow at the Center for HxA Center for Academic Pluralism, and she's also a board member of the National Association of Scholars. Her latest book, which came out in 2020, is Repatriation and Erasing the Past. Kathleen Richardson is a professor of ethics and culture of robots and AI, and the director of a research group, Women, Ethics, Robots, AI, and Data, at the De Montfort University in Leicester, England. She is the author of An Anthropology of Robots and AI, Annihilation, Anxiety, and Machines, 2015, Challenging Sociality, Attachment, Autism, and Robots, 2018, and co-editor of Asexual Politics of Sex Robots and Sex Dolls, 2023. Michelle Sirois has taught anthropology for more than 9 years. She is currently president of a feminist group that defends women's rights, the PDF in Quebec. Silvia Carrasco is a professor of social anthropology at the Autonomous University of Barcelona, Spain. She has recently coordinated the research and book Co-Education Kidnapped, Feminist Critique of the Penetration of Transgender Ideas in Education, 2022, which is already in its 3rd edition, and the report From Adult Men to Adolescent Girls, a data analysis of referral to the Catalan Gender Identity Service in public health over the past 10 years. She is also the president of Feministes de Catalunya, Feminists of Catalonia, and the vice president of the Feminist Teachers for Coeducation. And our discussant, as I mentioned a moment ago, is Carol Hooven. Carol is a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and associate at Harvard's Department of Psychology in the lab of Steve Pinker. She's an active member of the newly established Council on Academic Freedom at Harvard, and the author of the recent book, T, The Story of Testosterone, the Hormone That Dominates and Divides Us. Under some duress, following her public statements about the binary nature of biological sex, she recently retired from her position as lecturer and co-director of undergraduate studies at Harvard's Department of Human Evolutionary Biology, which has been her academic home for over 20 years, where she was beloved by her students and by her colleagues alike. We'll begin with the first panel. Kathleen Lowry, please.
All right, well, thank you so much for that introduction. And I also just want to give my thanks on behalf of all of the panelists to HxA for inviting us to have the opportunity to share these ideas and to meet with one another. We're very, very grateful. So because I have 15 minutes, I'm going to talk fast so you all can read my title, and I'll move on to the next slide. Here we go. All right, so who's afraid of grand narratives? Well, after a long hiatus, not anthropologists anymore. So we had gone through a period where we had sort of retreated onto the ground of situated and partial knowledges, but more recently, and particularly March, with the publication of this book, The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wingrove, which was both much praised and much reviled, but certainly much noticed. Grand narratives are back, baby. Now, although the explanation for why grand narratives had disappeared had to do with supposedly the idea that they were imperialist and colonialist, at least one feminist in 1987, and this is Nancy Hartsock, notice that academia got really nervous about master narratives right around the time that whom we might call non-masters, sort of women, people of color, started having big ideas of their own about the whole story of the human story. And the era in question would be the 1970s. So there was a brief fluorescence of interest in the anthropology of women and the role of women as women, particularly in the 1970s, and it was rapidly squelched, interestingly enough, by feminist anthropologists. So two sort of landmark moments. One is the publication, it's actually in 1983, but based on work mostly put together in the 1970s, of the edited volume Woman the Gatherer by Frances Dahlberg. Now, this was a riposte to Congress that had happened in 1966 called Man the Hunter, that really put sort of male technologies, hunting, that sort of thing at the center of the human story. And this was an attempt to say, well, what is the place of women in the human story? One of the interesting findings, as many of you may know, is that in foraging societies, women actually women's gathering provides most of the daily calories. But really rapidly, as early as 1985, there was this landmark essay by Donna Haraway, The Cyborg Manifesto, and it ends with a really famous line, "I'd rather be a cyborg than a goddess." And the latter-day reception of this has been that this is about being kind of a hard-nosed, pragmatic feminist oriented towards the present and the future, not kind of having fantasies about earth goddesses in the primeval forest. Haraway has this wonderful line about being a feminist in spectacles. So these spectacles are augmenting my bodily capacities, so I am already a cyborg. Nevertheless, there was something about this rejection of the earth goddess view of the role of women that seems in some ways to have been almost a precondition for academic success in anthropology after the 1980s. So like you could hardly be more successful. Donna Haraway is one of the most famous anthropologists in the world, but somebody like Max Dashu, who was actually interested in kind of that goddess tradition, she has had a career, started at Harvard, but she's had a career entirely outside of the mainstream academy, and she's written really interestingly about her own kind of para-academic career. But there was definitely a split in anthropology back in the day. Now, has that been a good thing? For nigh on 50 years, the feminist squelchers have been announcing their own dashing avant-gardeness, that like, look at these goddesses, like who would want to be one of those? Wouldn't you rather be like a super groovy cyborg? It's of course not Donna Haraway's fault that if you put female cyborg into a Google search engine, you're going to get this kind of image, like super sexy, often holding weaponry. But it's nevertheless, I think, meaningful that the avatar of feminist anthropology is the cyborg rather than the goddess. And the cyborg seems to me to consist of a pastiche of male chauvinism and late capitalist anti-humanist boosterism. To the point that sometimes what passes for feminist anthropology today, and I recognize that I'm not being intellectually charitable, as is the HxA way, but I think some of it truly is woeful. So many of you may have heard about this recent study, Abigail Anderson et al., that said women in foraging societies have always hunted as much as men. It's rapidly been debunked. It's just not true. But what bothers me about it is this idea, instead of that tradition that was woman the gatherer, what is woman's role in human history, this idea that whatever men do is the standard of humanity, and then the insistence that women do whatever that is as well. Another example would be Sophie Lewis's book, Full Surrogacy Now, Feminism Against Family. Sophie Lewis is really inspired by Donna Haraway. Donna Haraway gives the book an amazing blurb. It starts from a putatively feminist place where it says reproductive labor is real labor that society should value. That sounds pretty feminist, but she talks about the bodies that do this kind of labor. And her idea is we should value that labor, and then the products of that labor should be equitably distributed throughout society. Okay, that sounds kind of groovy, but what she's actually talking about is taking babies away from mothers. It's not any kind of body that does that work. It's a woman's body. It's a mother's body. And it's about taking babies away from mothers and then distributing throughout society. That is the oldest patriarchal idea in the book. And that's now what passes for feminism. It is quite lamentable. There is new language in anthropology. So instead of women, we speak of genders and bodies. And we've actually been doing this for a while in anthropology, at least since the 90s, and in some places since the mid-80s. Instead of humans, anthropologists speak of species. Multi-species ethnographies are now all the rage. Now, part of that is interesting. It's about humans living in community with all kinds of other organisms and entities. At the same time, I think this is also a reaction to anthropology having gone through a real crisis of self-confidence when some of the objects of our study began to read our ethnographies and object to them. So if you're doing multi-species ethnographies, the bedbugs and the salmon are never going to write a scathing review of your ethnography of their community. And I think that appeals to many anthropologists today. The image here is about, there's a famous case involving Nancy Shepherd Hughes. Some anthropologists in the audience will know this backstory. Also in anthropology, instead of talking about generating new knowledge, there's been this ontological turn where we think about a lot about the possibility of producing knowledge at all, or is thinking about multiculturalism just a Western obsession, which some of this literature is interesting, but I feel like there's a way in which it's not producing a lot of interesting new knowledge, and it is unfortunate. Now, there is an kind of internet intellectual manosphere that is convinced that the reason all of these things have happened is because, and one of the big figures in this is a guy calls himself Bronze Age pervert, but he's just kind of an exemplar of a much wider intellectual manosphere that says really the problem is there's just too many women in academia, too many women's values in academia. Girls and their cooties have turned academia into a matriarchal longhouse. This is one of their preferred ways of expressing this notion. But I want to try to persuade you in the time I have remaining that the problem is not too many girl cooties in academia, but in fact, too few. So I'm going to go through in the time I have remaining what I call a gynapology, and this is what I'm writing a book about right now, of sexed human stories. So I'm going to give you 3 quick examples, one from evolution, one from human prehistory, and one having to do with the emergence of social complexity and hierarchy. And in each case, I'm harking back to work first done by women and scholars in the 1970s that is now coming around for a second look. So the first example is having to do with evolution, the so-called aquatic ape hypothesis. It wasn't first put forward by Elaine Morgan. That was first put forward by a guy named Alistair Hardy, but Elaine Morgan was its kind of major popular proponent. She wrote a book in 1972, The Descent of Woman. It's a hilarious, very interesting book. It makes a scathing critique of male chauvinist stories of human evolution. However, it also did contain many scientific mistakes, and she essentially spent the remainder of her life and career continuing to publish and work and refine this hypothesis. It's been treated just with incredible disdain within anthropology. It continues to be treated with disdain within anthropology. But if you're interested, there was a very interesting 2-part radio program that summarizes a lot of the reasons that at least some people are having a second look at this hypothesis. It's now called the waterside ape hypothesis because aquatic ape became sort of untouchable because of the criticisms directed at Elaine Morgan. And interestingly enough, much of the evidence for the waterside ape hypothesis is literally soft. So it's a watery hypothesis about human evolution. It has to do with the distribution of fat in our bodies, the distribution of fat in our brains. It has to do with breath and respiration. Now, it's not the fault of the patriarchy that bones preserve better in the archaeological record than fat does, let alone breath, but that does direct the anthropological imagination down certain avenues rather than other avenues, and there's something interesting happening there with evolution. The next example I want to speak about has to do with human prehistory. So Maria Gimbutas was a Lithuanian archaeologist. She published a ton. Right here is a book from 1974, but she published many books before and after this. And she had an idea about the Indo-Europeanization of what she called Old Europe. And she proposed that the Indo-Europeanization had been the result of a literal invasion, that it was a sexed invasion, that it was an invasion, it was a martial invasion led by men that brought up a determinedly patriarchal culture to what she called the matristic society of Old Europe. She's often accused of being a matriarchalist. She was very careful to avoid the word matriarchal. She actually envisioned a more egalitarian society that then was invaded by the Indo-Europeans. She was treated as a fantasist for years. In 2015, Ancient DNA Analysis essentially showed that Maria Gimbutas was right, that it tells a sex story of Y chromosomes change before and after the Indo-European arrival, which is a story of men killing other men. Now, In Maria Gimbutas's case, her evidence was in a certain sense so soft as to be gossamer. It was evidence having to do with pure spirit. So she was reviled for paying a lot of attention to the symbolic interpretation of material culture. So she thought it was significant that you see much more female iconography before the Indo-European period and much more male iconography afterwards. And she suggested this told a story of people, not of pots. If you're an archaeologist, you'll get that joke. If you're not an archaeologist, it doesn't matter. This has to do with Colin Renfrew's work, and actually Colin Renfrew conceded Maria Gimbutas had been magnificently vindicated by the 2015 findings. If you're interested in Gimbutas, I really highly recommend this Spretnak article I have on the screen right now. But moving on. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about the emergence of social complexity. So, and this is another arena in which soft evidence can play a role, and soft evidence linked to women can tell a certain kind of story. So here I'm drawing on the work of Annette Weiner. Her first book on this topic was published in 1976, Women of Value, Men of Renown. She continued to publish on this topic up into her death. On textiles and women, Elizabeth Wayland Barber is another important figure in this field. Her wonderful book, Women's Work, The First 20,000 Years. But at any rate, when we talk about the emergence of social hierarchy, we tend to talk about agricultural surpluses, record-keeping systems, those cuneiform tablets, ziggurats, weaponry, the hard undertakings of hard men. This is the image of the Bronze Age that Bronze Age pervert takes as like, wow, I'm one of those Bronze Age men who's super rough and tough. But hierarchies also are systems for creating new kinds of people, and they use symbolic media to validate and communicate these new social statuses. Now, it turns out cloth was very important to this, that cloth was the literally first soft power of imperialism. So Gerda Lerner, somebody who was in this sort of older feminist tradition that thought about women, in her book, Creation of Patriarchy, she says women were the first slaves in empires. Now, obviously, young women were exploited for sexual and reproductive purposes, but typically you didn't kill off the middle-aged and older women, you hauled them off as well. Why? You put them to work making textiles. Textiles were both a valuable trade good in and of themselves, but also they were an incredibly important symbolic media for transmitting messages about power and also for validating messages about power. And part of what made textiles able to do this was textiles are typically made, in most cross-culturally, are made by women. And Weiner wrote a lot about the way that the production of textiles was also always associated with fertility magic and kind of women's power of making people, and this magic sort of imbuing the process of making textiles themselves. So if you wanted to validate some people as being a more important sort of person, you could do it literally with dress. You could do it with like, this person is going to be draped in this special kind of cloth. You could transmit cloth to transmit statuses. So this kind of soft power being important in the human story. Okay, so those are my 3 examples that again, I'm writing a book about this right now. But I want to end by saying that despite what happened to us, I think we're actually at a moment of tremendous promise in anthropology. We can still tell sweeping and true stories that are deeply rooted in the human past, that are relevant to the human present. That I also think a feminist tradition that paid specific attention to women in the human story is turning out to have been prescient. And a feminist tradition that instead focused on genders, on bodies, is, in my opinion, starting to look pretty silly. So I think what happened to our panel is actually not a bad sign. It's a sign of a paradigm that is crumbling and flailing as it goes down. And I'm looking forward to what comes next. And I hope you all are as well. I'm also literally looking forward to what comes next in the form of the next few talks. If anyone who's interested in the references, I can pass them along to you, but now I'll just hand it over to the next speaker. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kathleen. Our next speaker is Elizabeth Weiss. Elizabeth? You're muted.
I'm not muted anymore. I don't think we'll ever get over that mute thing. So I'm going to talk about bones. Anthropologists who study skeletal remains consist of bioarchaeologists who study skeletal remains from the archaeological record to reconstruct past people's lives, osteologists who use remains to understand bone biology, and forensic anthropologists who examine skeletal remains to help identify crime victims. The physical anthropologists engaging in answering questions in these three subfields often overlap. For instance, I've published in all three of these subfields. What unites the work is a focus on skeletal remains of humans. One of the first and most essential factors to consider when looking at skeletal remains is the biological sex of the deceased individual. Another important factor is the age of the individual. We are better at sex estimation, which is also sometimes referred to as sex identification or determination, than age estimation. Although sex estimation may be suggestive of a numeric value, it serves to indicate that anthropologists are not always correct in their determination. Most anthropologists will use a 5-point scale of sex from male to probable male to unknown to probable female to female. This range and the term estimation should not be taken to mean those remains whose bones are not easily identified as male or female belong to a non-binary individual. Sex, when looking at human biology, is binary. Anthropologists' tools or methods to determine sex of a past individual are not perfect, and sometimes the decision is made to label the individual as unknown, probable male, or probable female. Some reasons for this difficulty can be because the remains are fragmentary. The individual may be prepubescent, in which case DNA may be the only way to assess sex, or the researcher may be less skilled at making the sex assessment. Over time, anthropologists have improved their sex identification techniques. With the use of the entire skeleton, sex identification nears 100%. Looking at a collection of donated bodies in Athens, Chevalopoulou and colleagues in a 2022 study, for instance, determined that the use of 4 pelvic traits alone could be used to correctly identify sex 98% of the time. Other body parts showed promising results as well. The first thoracic vertebral bone, for example, was correct 90% of the time. And cross-sections of the humerus or upper arm bone had a 97% accuracy rates. Keswaran and Hackman in a 2019 study of Scottish cervical or neck bones found that sex differences were present in all measurements and accuracy rates ranged from 77 to 100%. And in a 2023 study on a Bulgarian sample by Toniva and colleagues, sex identification was 95.3% accurate when using the mandibular landmarks for the lower jawbone. It appears that although the pelvis is the most useful part of the skeleton to determine whether one was a male or female, nearly the entire skeleton, the kneecaps, backbones, arms, legs, skull, and jaw all show consistent sex differences. A large part of the postcranial differences between males and females is driven by hormonal influences of bone deposition and resorption. Male hormones like androgen result in periosteal or outer bone deposition, and the end outcome is a larger, more robust cross-section with greater muscle markers on the bone. Females have lower rates of bone deposition and slower rates of resorption on the endosteum, the inner part of the bone, which results in a greater gracility of the bones. My own early research was on muscle markers, and it was during this research that I became aware that traits were being used to reconstruct activities and culture that were actually more determined by biological sex differences. The use of these traits to reconstruct the past was giving past females a reputation for not being as hardworking as the males. And this I knew could not be true. Instead, we had to adjust for body size, sex, and age differences to see what was left over for reconstructions. And really, there wasn't much. It doesn't matter if the bones are from a recent population or a prehistoric sample. It doesn't matter the culture or the location of the sample. When something is so universal, it must be driven by biology. And humans are biologically sexually dimorphic, and sex in humans is binary. Thus, when looking at skeletal remains to test a variety of hypotheses, we must take into account biological sex differences. In health studies, such as those on anemia, sex differences need to be taken into account to assess differences between and within populations. For instance, if one is trying to determine cultural differences in diet, that is, did males and females have access to different food resources, we need to take into account biological sex differences first. Otherwise, you might falsely conclude that males were getting more iron-rich food due to their culture. Understanding the differential treatment of boys and girls and infanticide risk has been helped through the use of ancient DNA that can help us understand which individuals were victims. This helps us understand past populations, but also puts preference for males in modern times into a perspective that may help us find solutions to this ongoing problem. There have been a few studies, especially those focused on single individuals, that suggest past populations did not consider sex binary. The general form of these studies revolves around a mismatch between artifacts and the sex as determined by skeletal remains or even DNA. Redfern and colleagues' study of an early Roman body found in London dating between AD 50 to AD 70 is one such study. In their 2017 study, the skeleton was found with grave goods such as pottery associated with females. Osteologically, the remains also looked to be female, but DNA taken from a molar tooth suggested otherwise. It was thus concluded that the body may be that of a non-binary individual. However, a re-examination of the remains with an updated DNA method using DNA from the petrous bone led to a correction. It turned out that all three lines of evidence, the bones, the DNA, and artifacts, suggest that the remains are indeed from a female. Thus, the mismatch should have signaled the need for further research rather than a jump to a conclusion that the female wasn't a female. This retesting gave us the truth, but this can only be done if the remains are preserved and not reburied. In other studies, the mismatch between artifacts and sex may simply reveal that sex roles were less limiting than previously thought. A male with sewing tools may mean that sewing wasn't just a female act. After all, both tailors and seamstresses have been known in many cultures. It seems backwards to assume that the binary sex fact is wrong because sex roles are more varied than previously assumed. Some may, however, point out that intersex and disorders of sexual development do exist, likely in about 0.018% of the population. This to some implies that human sex is not binary. However, these deviations from the norm are best understood as pathologies, that is, defects many times congenital. And in modern people, most of these individuals, over 97% of them, are sterile. Thus, there may be some times when an individual's sex is unknown as a result of such an abnormality, but it is also a false equivalency to state that these variations constitute other sexes. This argument is like saying that because some individuals have extra fingers, also known as polydactyly, the normal human hand with 5 fingers is a falsehood, and that humans actually have hands with between 5 and 7 fingers. Incidentally, polydactyly rate is about the same rate of intersex or disorders of sexual development. This does not mean that we should not study these abnormalities, but they fall under paleopathology in the study of past peoples. Anthropologists have been key in determining polydactyly is, for instance, more common in inbred cultures that have high rates of cousin marriages. Furthermore, many of the individuals with disorders of sexual development have bones that still display either male or female morphology. Let's talk about forensics. Forensic anthropologists must continue to identify sex to help victims of crime. Knowing the sex also enables a more accurate age estimate, since males and females develop at different rates. In seniors, female skulls may start to take on some male features due to hormonal changes after menopause, but the pelvis and the overall postcranial differences still reveal the individual sex. Determining sex and age helps the identification of the victim, and thus may help to bring justice and closure to the victim's loved ones. If forensic anthropologists abandon their sex identification tools to appease the political agenda of erasing binary sex in anthropological research, we would be doing harm to the most vulnerable of individuals, those who died at the hands of another, or who died in circumstances where they were alone and perhaps not even missed until their bodies became bones. And this field of anthropology also needs to move towards ways to identify gender, how someone chooses to express or display their femininity or masculinity. Gender is not binary, although in many individuals, indeed I would say in most, especially before the present era, gender and sex are strongly correlated. Even indigenous terms such as two-spirit are recent additions to the culture. The term two-spirit was coined in 1990 by Myra Laramie. Now, there is an increase in people who identify as a boy or man while they are actually females and vice versa. Trying to determine gender in forensics is currently being studied. For instance, Shaw and colleagues in a 2020 study looked at CT scans of individuals who had facial feminization surgery, including reducing the forehead and chin sizes. These surgeries alter bone. Yet, with the most widely used forensic identification software that has an enormous database, 4DISC, the individuals who had undergone surgery were still identified as males. Flaherty and colleagues in a 2023 study looked at an individual who had transitioned from a biological man to a trans identifying as a woman. Even though this male was effeminate before transitioning and had years of medical transitioning, the 4DISC software still listed the individual as male. One complicating factor is that this individual had received testosterone from 11 to 14 years of age due to his effeminate features. Other studies, all of which focus on surgical and medical transitions of males into non-biological women, have also failed to identify the people's chosen genders. It appears that biological sex differences are more difficult to erase than we could have even imagined. I'd like to end on an area of study that anthropologists can play a key role in, understanding the effects medical transitioning has on bones in early transitioners. Hormone therapy studies are starting to reveal that bone health, especially for a male who wants to become a woman, is greatly compromised. These individuals triple their risk of bone fractures. Their trabecular bone structure is greatly diminished, and they tend to have shortened statures. These risks may lead to a tsunami of osteoporotic individuals that we are unprepared for. For most of human history, osteoporosis was a woman's problem. Other issues are yet unknown. Other issues that are yet unknown are how severe puberty blocker bone issues can become, and whether these are eliminated through transition or detransition. For instance, Bogers and colleagues in a 2023 study found that teens who go on puberty blockers have far lower bone mineral density. And Latham in a 2022 review article points out that even at age 22, years after puberty blockers were given and cross-sex hormones were started, both males and females had significant decreases in bone density compared to their peers, which will increase osteoporosis and fractures later in life. Bone loss increases as long as puberty is suppressed, and even after reintroducing sex hormones such as estrogen, peak healthy bone mass may not be obtained. We are putting people at risk of health problems decades into their future, risks that children are unlikely able to assess. Anthropologists need to be at the forefront of understanding these risks to ensure that every child has the opportunity to grow up with healthy bones, since healthy bones are a fundamental component to a healthy life. Thank you. You are muted.
Thank you. Thanks, Elizabeth. We do it back and forth, you and I. Thanks, Elizabeth. I just want to mention that we have over 300 people in the audience. If you like to make comments, please do so. Do follow the HxA way, please. I'll also just mention that if in the audience, if you'd like to upvote questions you want to have us discuss in the Q&A, please do so. Our next panelist is Kathleen Richardson. Kathleen.
Can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Is it one image?
It's extremely well done.
Okay, good. All right. I'd like to thank Kathleen and all the panelists for putting the panel together, even though we were cancelled, and Heterodox for hosting the event tonight. Let's see.
Kathleen, we're seeing your presenter view. If you'd be able to
Yeah.
show the view, it'll be larger.
How do I get that other view? Let me just end that a second. I did this earlier, and
I think if you hit slideshow from beginning.
I did
Yeah.
that, but let's see if no, that doesn't work. No, that doesn't work. Yeah, you can see play from current slide. No, that doesn't
Go
work.
click on swap if you go back to that and you click on swap displays, you can select it. See the swap displays button?
Perfect. There we
There
go. Now I know. I've always wondered how that works. All right, fantastic. So off we go. Sex is a meaningful and necessary analytic category for making sense of robots and AI and technology in general. So my research explores the relationships between persons and things, humans, animals and property, reality and fiction. And over there, that's one of the earlier dramatizations of the figure of the robot, which was a character in a play called Rossum's Universal Robots. And as you can see, very human-like. So key themes from my work, I would say, are a study of property relations. And this isn't just a study of an economic system, but it looks at how there is a move now to break down distinctions between people and property and present forms of property, personified property, back to people so that they can have relationships with them. And this is most done in those kind of technologies that have anthropomorphic features in some way, either their physicality or aspects of their form and production. I see robots as made up things. Sometimes they are made up in the form of in a fiction, in a book, and sometimes they're made up in a lab. I don't make a distinction between real robots and made up robots that are fictional and real ones that are made in labs. They're all made up. I mean, that's the point of them. And I kind of created an umbrella term, representational technologies of the human. And I derived this idea for thinking about mimesis, particularly inspired by the work of Walter Benjamin and Michael Taussig. And again, it's always, what is made up is always made up by people making up things. And why do I approach, how do I approach the issues that I've faced in my own research, is by drawing on studies actually that are outside anthropology, that are outside the orthodoxy, because as Kathleen has alluded to there earlier, some of the theories just aren't really able to make sense of some of the findings in my work. So in my own work, I've been drawing on attachment studies, feminist analysis of the global sexual exploitation trade, and political and psychological theories. Now, I can't tell you everything about my work, but I wanted to think, what did I learn from studying robots and AI? And what does it tell us about the way gender ideologies are trying to erase biological sex? So one key finding from my work that I think is very relevant is this idea in orthodox mainstream anthropology that the categories of real and fiction are blurred. They're indistinguishable now. It's impossible to really say that one exists or the other. And I regard this as a rejection of material reality in favor of a fantasy. And in order to service that fantasy, you must have a surplus of fiction, i.e., you've got to create more fiction in order to support it. And in that context, words and images are regarded as ontologically identical to social relationships, physical bodies and material realities. And what do I mean by that? I'm going to give you an example. So I was in a lab with a scientist who was about to present a humanoid robot to a group of people who were visiting the lab. And like many robots in lab, it didn't work. It had broken down. And rather than tell the audience that the robot was no longer working, the robotic scientist decided to act out. He said, look, the robot's not working, but I'm going to show you what the robot will do. And he started to make the movements, mechanical movements of the robot. And then rather than the real situation was this machine unable to work, instead, he'd started to create a fiction around it working. And then in order to elaborate it more, he said, and in the future, the robot will be able to do X, Y, and Z. So it's this idea that the real material situation is one thing, but actually people are describing it in a completely different way. And actually the real and fiction wasn't broken down in my research. In fact, they were very real. But in anthropological theorizing, we're told that they're not real. So how does this then impact the world of technology? Well, as technologists are in charge not only of how we acquire information in the world. So if you ask ChatGPT, what is a woman? They will have a sex-based idea, but then we'll go on to propose gender theory. So that kind of shows you that this is not a neutral system. There's no, a person behind the scenes who has a non-political perspective on this. In fact, a lot of these terms now are being replayed through this gender ideological prism. What is a woman in ChatGPT is just one of them. Also, we find that these big organizations like the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence at Cambridge, they published a report on AI and gender. And again, they had changed the meaning of the word woman to include trans identities. Now, this is a report. This is they're trying to make an intervention, describe the context in which, and here gender. When we say the word gender, often it's as a synonym for sex, or it used to be. But when we talked about gender, we really talked about women, didn't we? But it's one of those ways in which words can start to disguise real meanings. But I think you need to talk about sex. You need to talk about sex differences between men and women for two reasons. One, in the context of the ideas, how they're produced from industry and academia, and also the things produced, what is being produced in the world, in addition to ChatGPT, sex robots, deepfakes, prostitution and porn, all these technological systems. So let's just look at some of the tech being produced. I know there's a lot of information on this slide, but we have, on the one hand, these representational technologies of women, which are highly sexualized, featuring women in subordinate, submissive poses and states, often characterized as slaves, men as dominant in these scenarios. And then you have situations like in Saudi Arabia. This is Sophia, the robot that was designed by David Hansen and others. And Saudi Arabia grants citizenship to a robot for the first time ever, while at the same time Amnesty International highlights that male guardianship is still an issue in Saudi Arabia, and women don't have full civil rights. So you can see this is really important that we talk about sex. Why are these sex differences taking place in all these contexts? Why are these issues occurring? Without a category of sex, we can't actually explain or make sense of them. What about deepfakes? Most of the narratives and discussions about deepfakes are about how politicians' imagery is being mimicked and represented, and speech that they have not expressed is the links between prostitution and porn and the tech industry are well discussed. So here we have a picture of Lena, which was used to develop some image signal processing software. why is a pornographic image used to develop this software? Because Alexander Sawchuk, there was a copy of Playboy in the lab, and that's what they looked at. So they're using pornography in the lab. And for some reason that clicked, but I'll just go back. And of course, the silencing of women, everything from the previous, so Twitter to Eventbrite, different organizations, Facebook, YouTube, banning discussion of biological sex. These are all things. I'm not going to go into a lot of it. I'm just going to do some headlines here. So who are the people creating the ideas? Well, we know that in computer sciences, for example, in Oxford, only 10%, there's only 10% female representation. Only 15% computer scientist graduates in the UK are female. There is some improvement in places like MIT, which in the 90s, there was a real problem and lots of people were concerned about how women would succeed in that kind of place. In industry, the figures are even more stark. 70% of total managerial professions in large Silicon Valley tech firms are men. And of course, there is race is a factor here when we're talking about women, Black women and Latina women. They make up even less of the workforce, and they're more likely to be the minority women employed in the kind of more manual occupations within those industries. So there's real overt evidence here. It's a very male-dominated field. And if we look back into the past, we know that it wasn't always male-dominated, because there is this idea that actually women aren't good at science, and that it's because we don't have these systematizing skills, and we all want to like empathize with each other. But actually, there's a long history where women played a pivotal role, Black women, as computers in the early development of computing technology. So another figure here is Ada Lovelace, English mathematician, credited for completing the first computer program, and by default, the first computer programmer. Did this at a time when women were denied the vote, women not allowed to study at university. So it was great when the Ada Lovelace Institution was created. It wasn't just created to advance women in the computer sciences. It was meant to be an independent voice, but some of their initiatives again have promoted gender ideology against, like, looking at biological sex and sex differentiation in terms of success in the computer sciences and tech industries. So here, this is looking at data, and apparently data systems that would distinguish on the basis of biological sex aren't picking up non-binary people. So there might be some instances where picking up biological sex is very important, perhaps if there's a surgery or, criminal detection, all kinds of systems that might be used. And actually, it's very accurate. These systems, not all the computer systems work well, but facial recognition is pretty good at detecting sex. Over 91% accuracy, and even higher than that in some cases. But people are saying, the critics who are promoting gender ideology and trans ideology are saying, no, we need these systems to detect non-binary and trans-identified individuals. But then that makes you ask, listening to Elizabeth talk there about characteristics at the skeletal level, how would these systems pick up this data? And I thought some of the comparisons might be with astrological signs, because actually, according to people interested in astrology, you can also guess the facial appearance of what someone looks like by their star signs. Apparently, Geminis, you can always tell them by their mouth because it's always moving. But it's this kind of thing. How do you, if you've got a subjective sense of yourself, how do you create a physical system that is only looking at the surface of your body in order to identify something, your physical characteristics? And I think it is a bit like astrology in that sense. So we all celebrate Ada Lovelace being a significant figure. There was Ada Lovelace recently. Here's an exhibit that I saw. It's supposed to feature 8 women in the computer sciences. If you do gender math, it's 8 women. It's 100% women representation. Actually, if you do sex math, it's 2 men and 6 women. Only 75% women representation. So two of those human beings are trans identified males. So it does matter. If there is a real problem, then how do you kind of address that problem? So I've been thinking about, well, there is this issue where we seem to be creating a lot of fictions about, we seem to have the reality, you know, the real facts about what's going on, how women are being represented, the differences between men and women, and then the move away from this to kind of towards gender ideology. So I wanted to think about the metaphor, the politics of dissociation, I call it. And I think it very much sums up what's going on in technology. To think about the metaphor of dissociation. And there are certain features of it in the DSM-5. And this is a metaphor that I'm using. I'm not saying society has a dissociative identity disorder, but amnesia, you know, gaps in memory, depersonalization, feeling robotic, feeling like parts of your body don't belong to you, derealization, a disconnection from familiar people, or things seem unreal and foreign, identity confusion, and identity alteration. So all the kind of characteristics that, in order to, if you're feeling grounded and in your body, and you're able to observe things and recognize them and see them. But if you're in a dissociative state, it's almost like this fiction is overriding everything that you might be experiencing. And I think the way in which anthropology describes the world around it sometimes is like this dissociative identity. I mean, perhaps 30 years ago, I would have used the politics of alienation, but as we've removed any discussion of human beings, and we don't even talk about alienation anymore, our disconnection from each other and our disconnection from the environment and other living beings. So what might the politics of dissociation look like? Well, the real is neglected while the fiction is amplified. So here we have some protesters throwing a statue because we've flattened the ontology between the people and the things. So here they are, they're throwing a statue into a river, but they're all taking photographs of this moment on their mobile phones. Inside their mobile phone is minerals that have been mined by real slaves. So this is an example of the politics of dissociation. If you wanted to address concerns about slavery in the world, you would do it by actually addressing what's happening. Instead, you create these fictions because fictions are easier to deal with than perhaps the real empirical transformation of politics. So I'm coming to an end of my talk. Obviously, everybody knows we're here. Thank you again, because again, transphobia in this context means believing in biological sex, which is most human beings on the earth. And you know, I thought it was really interesting because the HxA put out a statement about the end to the violence in the Middle East. And this was someone on Twitter who identified this. They said they're deeply concerned about academic freedom, which is not the case. So it just goes to show you what double standards they have, depending on what political position they have. So what are you in for? I said biological sex is real. New kind of witch finders that are rooting out people who have different points of view, different perspectives, and are not allowed to put their points of view across. And this is my last slide. So I'm quite fortunate. I'm the first person in my family to go to university. I grew up in a housing estate in Nottingham. I was on free school meals, and actually free school meals now is a measure of how poor you are. And it's a measure that they use to assess children from deprived backgrounds going into higher education. And actually only 3.3% do master's level. So without any anyone in my family, coming from this very deprived background, I went to university and I went to UCL and Cambridge, and I was allowed to have my own subjectivity. I was allowed to develop my ideas. And even though people disagreed with me and I disagreed with them, I had the right to my subjectivity. That's not the case anymore. And in fact, you know, there are going to be points where we're arguing or where we're discussing things. But at the end of the day, I think it's okay that people have passionate beliefs, right? And people believe that they're right and other people are wrong. I guess what's happened now is they're using that power to stop people having any kind of discussion about alternative perspectives. And, you know, I think university for me was this really aspirational place where you went and you debated ideas. And through that work, I have done all this really exciting research. And I've also tried to come up with new ideas myself about how we create a better world, how we develop connection with each other. But all that, you know, I think we've got to get back to that, or we've got to have it in a way where we can start exercising our right to subjectivity again.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kathleen. I'd like to remind people that if you go to the Q&A, you can upvote questions you want to have us discuss in the Q&A period. Our next speaker is Michelle Serrois. Michelle is the president of PDF in Quebec. She'll be delivering her remarks in French, and you can see her, the translation will be made available to you. Michelle, please.
OK. Merci. Thank you. La question du sexe et du genre est devenue un terrain mouvant. Mets la diapo. Oui. Ah, la diapo.
Está bien. Bien.
Un instant. Où est-ce qu'on a? Faut que tu enlèves la vue large. Ah oui, oui. Est-ce qu'on partage?
Non, non, il faut partager. Redonne-moi. T'es où là? Où est-ce que t'es? Là? Ok. There. Share. Tu peux demander? Do you see the screen?
Yes.
OK, là, pour faire à partir du début. Voilà. Ah, reviens.
Ah, sorry.
OK.
Je sais pas comment revenir.
OK. Alors, la question du sexe et du genre est devenue un terrain mouvant à la suite de l'action de divers groupes de pression. Ces changements sociaux ont davantage pénétré le monde anglophone que chez les francophones, et cela parce que la langue française est une langue de tradition latine et fortement sexuée, ce qui fait qu'elle est beaucoup moins encline à remplacer la catégorie sexe par le mot genre. Par contre, cela se fait de plus en plus en anglais, notamment depuis les années 90 où l'idéologie queer a pris de l'ampleur. Prenons l'exemple du Canada. Il existe un programme appelé en français Analyse comparative entre les sexes, ou ACS, un titre qui implique qu'il y a au moins 2 sexes. En anglais, cela s'appelle Gender-Based Analysis, soit l'analyse basée sur le genre, la catégorie sexe étant évacuée, ce qui n'est pas le cas en français. L'ACS avait l'objectif initial d'analyser les effets politiques, des programmes, des lois sur les femmes pour réaliser une meilleure égalité des sexes. Cependant, l'ACS a été remplacé en 2017 par l'ACS+, et le plus fait toute la différence. Après l'adoption de la loi C16 en 2017, une loi qui ajoutait dans la Charte canadienne des droits et libertés, ainsi que dans le Code criminel, 2 nouvelles catégories que sont l'identité de genre et l'expression de genre. Comme on le constate sur cette diapositive, cette mesure de protection des femmes a été diluée par l'introduction de l'analyse intersectionnelle des rapports sociaux, Ainsi, les femmes ne sont plus qu'un groupe parmi un large éventail de groupes opprimés. Alors, il y a race, origine ethnique, religion, âge, présence de handicap qui doivent être regardés. Les femmes, donc, sont mêlées maintenant à toutes les autres. L'année suivante, en 2018, le ministère Conditions féminines Canada, ça faisait 3 ans qu'il existait, il a été remplacé par un nouveau ministère intitulé Femmes et égalité des genres. Le mandat de ce nouveau ministère recouvre 2 volets et encore une fois, la recherche de l'égalité entre les sexes se retrouve diluée dans la lutte contre la discrimination vécue par beaucoup d'autres groupes opprimés. Comme on le voit, ils ont ajouté à la partie sexe, catégorie sexe, l'orientation sexuelle, l'identité, l'expression de genre. Mais en plus, ça devait se faire en interaction avec d'autres facteurs identitaires, comme vous pouvez lire, notamment la race, l'origine nationale, ethnique, l'origine autochtone, l'âge, orientation sexuelle, les conditions socio-économiques, lieu de résidence et handicap. Bref, encore une fois, les femmes sont de plus en plus perdues parmi un tas de luttes contre des oppressions autres que celles du sexe. Abordons la question des différences entre sexe et genre. Il existe bien une binarité biologique des sexes, sur laquelle se greffent des rôles sociaux, des statuts, des habitudes culturelles. De nombreuses enquêtes anthropologiques et historiques ont alimenté cette diversité culturelle. Une des pionnières de l'anthropologie, Margaret Mead, ne parlait pas de genre, mais bien de sexe, comme dans son livre publié en 1937 qui s'appelait « Sex and Temperament in Three Primitive Societies ». Et elle parlait aussi de la binarité des sexes dans son livre publié en 1949, « Male and Female ». De même, les paléontologues qui ont découvert le squelette fossile d'une australopithèque qui a vécu en Éthiopie il y a plus de 3 millions d'années l'ont appelée Lucy, car beaucoup d'indices portaient à croire qu'il s'agissait bien d'une femelle. Donc, on ne savait rien de son genre, mais on se prononçait sur le sexe du squelette. L'anthropologie nous a appris que la nature humaine est un substrat universel, lequel est façonné par un conditionnement social qui est variable d'une culture à l'autre et d'une époque à l'autre. Comme le montre ce diapo qui résume les différences entre sexe et genre. Donc, il y a un dimorphisme au niveau du sexe, mais il y a pluralité au niveau du genre, parce que ça varie d'une culture à l'autre, d'une époque à l'autre. Donc, il y a le féminin, le masculin et d'autres identités de genre. Cette diapositive aussi est même concept qui se retrouvait à l'Organisation mondiale de la santé. Je dis bien qu'il se retrouvait avant 2018. Cette diapo dit que la même chose que ce qui vient d'être dit, le mot sexe, ses caractéristiques biologiques et autres, le mot genre sert à évoquer des rôles sociaux. Eh bien, cette définition, cette présentation du sexe et du genre qui se retrouvait à l'OMS avant 2018, la page a été enlevée et on ne retrouve plus de définition du sexe à l'OMS, à l'Organisation mondiale de la santé. Il a fallu le retrouver il y a un mois sur le site du Conseil de l'Europe. Là, on a retrouvé, mais plus du tout dans le site de l'Organisation mondiale de la santé. En fait, on constate la pénétration des idéologies queer et intersectionnelles dans plusieurs institutions internationales ainsi qu'au gouvernement canadien, ce qui a bouleversé ces deux concepts-là. La définition du mot sexe disparaît progressivement. Quand on en parle, c'est souvent pour dire le sexe assigné à la naissance, alors qu'on devrait dire le sexe constaté à la naissance. Demain, Statistique Canada remplace maintenant le mot sexe par le mot genre, sauf pour les domaines de la démographie et de la santé. Et là-dessus, on suit les instructions provenant du Conseil du Trésor du Canada. Et qu'est-ce que ça dit? Ça dit bien que les organismes gouvernementaux ne doivent employer le mot sexe que de façon exceptionnelle, OK? Pour des données justement sur la démographie et sur la santé. L'emploi du mot sexe semble être devenu tabou, et pas seulement dans les associations d'anthropologues. Défendre la catégorie sexe, la binarité biologique, c'est entraîner des accusations de transphobie. Quant au mot genre, on constate un glissement. D'une définition plutôt objective présentant le genre comme un ensemble de stéréotypes construits socialement, le genre est maintenant de plus en plus représenté comme subjectif, autodéterminé à partir du ressenti individuel. C'est difficile de se comprendre à ce moment-là, parce que l'auto-identification peut devenir effectivement très problématique dans des lieux non mixtes, sécurisés pour les femmes, tels que les prisons, les toilettes, les vestiaires, les abris pour femmes vulnérables. Eh bien, il y a des hommes qui peuvent y pénétrer maintenant parce qu'ils se disent femmes. Certains hommes peuvent même être des agresseurs sexuels. C'est d'ailleurs cette idéologie queer qu'on voit émerger en 2023, cette année, au Collège des médecins du Québec. Auparavant, la reconnaissance de la binarité des sexes chez les médecins a permis d'établir des statistiques qui montrent le progrès que font les femmes dans la pratique de la médecine. Comme on le voit dans cette diapositive-là, les femmes, en 2004, les femmes médecins étaient 37%, et puis elles représentent 55% du total des médecins inscrits au Collège des médecins. Mais comment va-t-on faire à l'avenir? Parce que le Collège des médecins a décidé de mettre en œuvre une nouvelle grille basée sur l'autodétermination et le ressenti. Comme vous voyez, il y a à peu près 12 termes sur lesquels les médecins peuvent s'inscrire, puis même, pour compliquer les choses, on a rajouté « autres ». Alors, vous voyez, 13 inscriptions, dont « autres » est ouvert. Alors, comment va-t-on suivre, établir, faire une logique historique sur les femmes et les hommes inscrits comme médecins? Quelles conséquences maintenant abordons pour les jeunes? De façon globale, le recensement de Statistique Canada 2021, je vais arriver avec des données maintenant, a révélé un nombre très restreint de personnes trans et non-binaires, soit 1/3 de 1%. Des gens disent c'est 1-2%, non, 1/3 de 1%. Alors, il faut bien sûr lutter contre les discriminations dont peuvent être victimes ces personnes, même si elles ne sont pas nombreuses. Par contre, il ne faut pas bouleverser, on peut se demander pourquoi on devrait bouleverser des référents aussi universels et fondamentaux que les catégories hommes et femmes, voire même effacer des réalités biologiques sous prétexte que cela heurterait une minorité de personnes. OK. Qu'est-ce qu'on apprend chez les jeunes aussi? Le Statistique Canada du recensement nous montre que on trouve 3 fois plus de jeunes entre 15 et 34 ans qui se définissent comme non-binaires que des personnes de 35 ans et plus. On commence à voir qu'il y a une tendance sociale, peut-être une mode, on n'a pas encore suffisamment de recul, mais on voit qu'il y a une différence entre les 35 ans et plus. De même, quant à la transition, on voit que les filles à la naissance, ce qui est à droite vers l'identité masculine, concerne surtout des personnes de moins de 35 ans. Quand on voit homme transgenre, j'ai fait ajouter fille à la naissance, OK? Parce que c'est mêlant sans ça. Alors, auparavant, c'était plutôt des garçons à la naissance qui ont transitionné vers l'identité féminine. Comme le montre le graphique, on voit qu'il y a plus d'hommes transitionnés vers les femmes, qu'ils appellent femmes transgenres, quand ils ont 35 ans et plus. Alors, on voit que la transition concerne maintenant davantage des jeunes filles et des jeunes adolescentes notamment. Quand on sait l'impact sur la santé physique et psychologique des personnes qui ont transitionné, Elisabeth Weiss en a parlé, notamment des risques d'ostéoporose, des risques aussi qui s'ajoutent d'infertilité, d'atteinte cardiovasculaire, l'accroissement soudain du nombre de jeunes qui transitionnent vers le sexe opposé mérite toute notre attention, comme le font plusieurs pays occidentaux, tels l'Angleterre, la Norvège, la Suède, qui révisent leur politique concernant la transition des mineurs. De plus, ils ont révisé, d'ailleurs, ces pays-là, on commence à réviser leur politique pour les mineurs. De plus, en éliminant progressivement la catégorie sexe, on observe une tendance sociale à invisibiliser les femmes. Au Québec, en 2023, le projet de loi 12, encadrant le recours aux mères porteuses, a fait l'objet d'une demande d'amendement pour effacer le mot femme, afin de ne garder que l'expression « personne qui porte l'enfant pour autrui ». Ça a provoqué un tollé et le ministre de la Justice a présenté dès le lendemain une motion déclarant ce que tout le monde sait actuellement, depuis toujours, à savoir que les femmes forment la moitié de la population, que ce sont les femmes qui accouchent et aussi qu'on ne doit pas éliminer le mot femme des textes de loi. Alors, vous voyez, on peut se demander qu'est-ce qui est arrivé pour que un ministre soit obligé d'aller au Parlement pour dire des choses que tout le monde sait. Il y a donc une tendance sociale inquiétante qui est d'enlever le mot sexe pour le remplacer par le mot genre. Or, à la catégorie sexe est attaché un certain nombre de droits qui sont très importants pour les femmes. Cependant, pour nous encourager, il y a des signaux qui montrent que la tendance commence à s'inverser. Dans le recensement scolaire au Royaume-Uni, on oblige maintenant les écoles à indiquer le sexe des enfants obligatoirement. Et le genre, lui, devient facultatif à noter. Au Québec, le ministre de l'Éducation, tout récemment, a maintenu les toilettes non mixtes, séparées pour les gars et les filles. Maintenant, parlons de la binarité sexuelle en regard de la maternité de substitution, c'est-à-dire la question des mères porteuses. Comme on n'a pas encore inventé l'utérus artificiel, la capacité biologique unique des femmes est encore essentielle pour produire les enfants. Les textes anthropologiques rapportent qu'il existe certaines sociétés qui pratiquent le rituel de la couvade, une pratique culturelle où les hommes simulent l'accouchement et reçoivent les gratifications symboliques qui y sont liées. Mais dans la réalité, aucune société n'est réellement dupe de ce stratagème d'appropriation symbolique d'une fonction biologique spécifique des femmes, sauf peut-être quelques militants de la transidentité qui nous disent que ce sont de vraies femmes qui accouchent. La binarité des sexes est pas des vraies femmes, des vrais hommes, désolé. La binarité des sexes est plus qu'évidente quand on voit le site de l'entreprise Canam Cryo Service, la plus importante entreprise commerciale qui fournit des gamètes et des embryons congelés pour la procréation assistée au Canada et à l'international. En consultant ce site, c'est une grande déception, très grande déception que vont vivre les personnes qui prônent l'abolition de la catégorie sexe, ainsi que les partisans de l'idéologie affirmant l'existence d'un continuum de sexe. En effet, on n'y voit que la binarité du sexe biologique. On remarque également, en bas de cette diapositive, à droite, en bas, qu'on souhaite bienvenue aux personnes de la communauté LGBT. C'est elle qui constitue une nouvelle clientèle en croissance et qui veut avoir des enfants issus de leur patrimoine génétique. C'est out la question de l'adoption. Les hommes veulent avoir des enfants de leur patrimoine, de leur sang, comme ils disaient avant, mais à condition de disposer de 150 000 $ canadiens et beaucoup plus aux États-Unis. Même si l'idéologie queer tente de déconstruire la binarité des sexes, l'industrie des mères porteuses recherche surtout des femmes biologiques et avec un utérus, et non pas une personne de sexe masculin à la naissance, même si cette personne se sent et s'auto-déclare femme. Les contrats de vente d'enfants et l'exploitation de la force reproductive de femmes pauvres et vulnérables posent de sérieuses questions quant à la marchandisation des êtres humains qui rapportent des milliards de profits à ces entreprises capitalistes internationales. En conclusion, je dirais que jusqu'au 20e siècle, le travail rigoureux des anthropologues tout le long du siècle a fait en sorte que l'anthropologie a été reconnue comme une science. Il est à craindre que l'effacement de la catégorie sexe par des militants de la transidentité en faveur de la catégorie du genre soit en train de miner la confiance dans la qualité scientifique de la discipline de l'anthropologie. Et parfois, j'ai honte de l'anthropologie quand j'ai vu qu'on nous éliminait complètement en disant qu'on ferait du tort à une communauté d'anthropologues LGBT. Ça, là, je ne comprends pas qu'on puisse faire ça. Merci beaucoup.
Michel, merci beaucoup. Our final,
Thank
our
you.
final, thank you. Our final panelist is Silvia Carrasco. Sylvia is joining us from Spain. It's late for her. We're just very grateful for you for staying up and and joining us in this panel. Sylvia. Please.
Thank you. I'm going to share my presentation. Again.
You're echoing.
Is it in? Okay.
No.
You see it?
Yes, it's the audio.
Excuse me. You don't hear me?
I'm sorry, we can't hear. Michael, can you help me here?
Hi, Sylvia. We're hearing an echo in your audio. Can you try muting and unmuting and reconnecting your audio, perhaps?
Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me now? You can?
It sounds like you have two microphones on.
I'm sorry, I don't. I don't know what I have to do. So. Now? Turn on speaker. Okay, I will.
Maybe log out and logging in again. It wasn't.
Sylvia, I log out. Okay, I'll log out and I'll log in again.
Thank you.
Bye. Yeah.
I'll remind you that if you'd like to go to the Q&A, you can add questions there for our Q&A discussion we'll be having after Carol Hubin's remarks. You can also upvote questions that you find of interest there.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's much better. Thank you so much.
Much better. Thank you. Then I'm trying to share again. Okay. Oh, this is it. Okay. Please let me know if you see the full screen. You do?
I think it works well enough, unless Michael wants to change it.
Thank you.
We can see your screen. If you'd like to go into slideshow mode, it'll be even bigger for us.
Apparently I am.
Presentation.
So, third attempt. Now. Okay.
I think that's fine. Why don't
That's fine, go ahead.
And now,
That's
do you
fine.
see it better?
Yes, it's fine. Please go ahead. It's no problem.
Okay, thank you. So, for more than 25 years, I have been researching educational inequalities with a special focus on students and with migrant and Roma backgrounds from an ethnographic and comparative approach. Comparative categories are essential in anthropology applied to social problems to do something as simple and as central.
Aux États-Unis. Même si l'idéologie queer tente de déconstruire la binarité des sexes, l'industrie des mères porteuses recherche surtout des femmes biologiques et avec un utérus, et non pas une personne de sexe masculin à la naissance, même si cette personne se sent et s'auto-déclare femme. Les contrats de vente d'enfants et l'exploitation de la force reproductive de femmes pauvres et vulnérables posent de sérieuses questions quant à la marchandisation des êtres humains qui rapportent des milliards de profits à ces entreprises capitalistes internationales. En conclusion, je dirais que jusqu'au 20e siècle, le travail rigoureux des anthropologues tout le long du siècle a fait en sorte que l'anthropologie a été reconnue comme une science. Il est à craindre que l'effacement de la catégorie sexe par des militants de la transidentité en faveur de la catégorie du genre soit en train de miner la confiance dans la qualité scientifique de la discipline de l'anthropologie. Et parfois, j'ai honte de l'anthropologie quand j'ai vu qu'on nous éliminait complètement en disant qu'on ferait du tort à une communauté d'anthropologues LGBT. Ça, là, je ne comprends pas qu'on puisse faire ça. Merci beaucoup.
Michel, merci beaucoup. Our final.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our final panelist is Silvia Carrasco. Sylvia is joining us from Spain. It's late for her. We're just very grateful for you for staying up and and joining us in this panel. Sylvia, please.
Thank you. I'm going to share my presentation again.
You're echoing.
Is it in? Okay.
No.
You see it?
Yes, it's the audio.
Excuse me. You don't hear me?
I'm sorry, we can't hear. Michael, can you help me here?
Hi, Sylvia. We're hearing an echo in your audio. Can you try muting and unmuting and reconnecting your audio, perhaps?
Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me now? You can?
It sounds like you have two microphones on.
I'm sorry, I don't. I don't know what I have to do, so. Now? Turn on speaker. Okay, I will.
Maybe log out and logging in again. It wasn't.
Sylvia,
I log out.
volume.
Okay, I'll log out and I'll log in again.
Thank you.
Bye. Yeah.
I'll remind you that if you'd like to go to the Q&A, you can add questions there for our Q&A discussion we'll be having after Carol Hubin's remarks. You can also upvote questions that you find of interest there.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's much better. Thank you so much.
Much better. Thank you. Then I'm trying to share again. Okay. Oh, this is it. Okay. Please let me know if you see the full screen. You do?
I think it works well enough, unless Michael wants to change it.
Thank you.
We can see
Oh.
your screen. If you'd like to go into slideshow mode, it'll be even bigger for us.
Oh, apparently I am.
Presentación.
So, third attempt. Now. Okay.
I think that's fine. Why don't
That's
you
fine. Go ahead.
And now,
That's
do you
fine.
see it better?
Yes, it's fine. Please go ahead. It's no problem.
Okay, thank you. So, for more than 25 years, I have been researching educational inequalities with a special focus on students and with migrant and Roma backgrounds from an ethnographic and comparative approach. Comparative categories are essential in anthropology applied to social problems to do something as simple and as central as to identify who are suffering from inequalities more or less. So sex is one. In September 2019, my team and I had completed a large project on risk and protective factors in early school living when I happened to dive into a new, unexpected one that shocked me as an anthropologist, as a woman, and as a feminist. This may not be widely known, but Spain is reported to be one of the European Union countries with comparatively lower levels of sexual violence against women. It compares well in several domains with other member states regarding the European Equality Index between women and men, and it ranks first in the world in the Women's Danger Index, which is based on the safety of countries for women traveling alone. But in conversations with some of my informants and friends who are teachers in primary and secondary schools, they told me they were deeply worried about the increase of violence against girls, old and new forms of sexual violence perpetrated by male close relatives or peers, while the denial of the very existence of sex-based oppression among boys was also growing. Besides, they were observing how boys at an ever younger age were searching for and watching porn on computers or just appearing on their smartphones. Accordingly, extremely sexist ideas about sexuality and gender roles seem to be enhanced rather than overcome. Therefore, they welcomed with hope, but also with surprise, what appeared to be a sudden and greater commitment on the part of the educational authorities to respond to this through a new co-education plan. The surprise came from the fact that those same authorities have never taken it very seriously beyond formal declarations, but rather relied on the personal initiatives of progressive feminist teachers to keep raising awareness of women's oppression and educate for change. In the social democratic tradition, co-education is much more than gathering girls and boys in the same classrooms to follow the same curriculum, but it is the key feminist tool to achieve equality between women and men, to eradicate androcentrism in the curriculum, and to struggle against ideas and attitudes that favor all forms of violence against women and girls. That is, in a word, an education plan to dismantle sex-based oppression, to make equality real and effective beyond its recognition by law.
Sylvia, I'm sorry to interrupt. We're still seeing your title slide. If you're looking to advance the slides, just know we're looking at the window that shows.
Something is happening. Yeah, sorry. Okay, now I've closed everything. Third attempt. My God. Okay. What do you see now?
First slide.
Okay, but not in the presentation mode.
No. But I think at this
Okay.
point, you might just want to go forward with the slides. Can you
Yeah.
go to the next slide or whichever slide you're speaking at?
For example, now, as I said,
Yes.
bit of a
That's
context,
the
I'm
third slide.
here.
That's
Okay.
the fourth, or that's the third, sorry.
So, okay, I'm really sorry. I'm really sorry.
Not a problem.
Does usually work. I don't know why it doesn't work today.
No
Okay.
problema.
So as I was saying, in the social democratic tradition, coeducation is much more than gathering girls and boys in the same classrooms to follow the same curriculum, but is the key feminist tool to achieve equality between women and men, to eradicate androcentrism in the curriculum, and to struggle against ideas and attitudes that favor all forms of violence against women and girls. That is, in a word, an education plan to dismantle sex-based oppression, to make equality real and effective beyond its recognition by law. But soon after this, a paradox became clear. This is the paradox I will talk about and the title of my paper, what I ironically call the intriguing disappearance of sex in the education against sex-based oppression, to understand why biological sex remains a necessary analytical category in anthropology, in this case, in the anthropology of education. So I'm going to talk about gender, sex, violence, women, girls, laws, education, and above all, power. So the Department of Education in Catalonia apparently had an ambitious plan to take a step forward in education for equality, finally developing the mandate of the regional, national, and international legislation on equality and against sex-based violence. All the Spanish acts related to the matter contain the sex and gender definition of the 2011 Istanbul Convention. That is, the Council of Europe Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence and Protecting Women Against All Forms of Violence Against Them. It's a long title, it's a huge task. It is a binding treaty for signatory countries, ratified by Spain in 2014, and its definition of gender is the socially constructed roles, behaviors, activities, and attributes that a given society considers appropriate for women and men, a very anthropological definition. This means gender is what is used to justify violence and oppression of women and girls. Consequently, the Convention's explanatory report emphasizes that, and I quote, the term gender under this definition is not intended as a replacement for the terms women and men used in the Convention. Moreover, equal education and education for equality are explicitly mentioned in the National and Regional Equality Acts as the key to cultural transformation to achieve a society free of violence against women and girls, also replicating Article 14 of the Istanbul Convention that states, parties shall take, where appropriate, the necessary steps to include teaching material on issues such as equality between women and men, non-stereotype gender roles, mutual respect, non-violent conflict resolution in interpersonal relationships, gender-based violence against women and the right to personal integrity, adapted to evolving capacity of learners in formal curricula and at all levels of education. And number two, parties shall take the necessary steps to promote the principles referred to in paragraph 1 in informal education facilities, as well as in sports, cultural and leisure facilities, and the media. However, my informants soon discovered, as I did later in my fieldwork, that the content of those training seminars, which have become compulsory for at least 2 teachers in every school since then, had nothing to do with feminist recommendations for education and were far from the Istanbul Convention and the Equality and Anti-Violence Acts. All the training focused on the introduction of the concepts of gender identity and sexual diversity. They were informed that schools had to become aware and adapt to what was presented as the trans reality, the existence of students who suffer because their true identity does not correspond to the male or female sexual characteristics of their body. A reality, language is very important here, that is presented as being largely ignored, perhaps even by the students who might be trans themselves, towards which all the traditional concepts of science and the language used to refer to humans as women or men, or the very definition based on old ideas of binary sex, are essentially violent categories imposed on diversity that hinder inclusion. But the fact is that the words women and girl are erased from the language and the teaching materials, and the very concept of violence against them is turned upside down. Shifting the meaning of gender and therefore the expression gender-based violence has become the norm, where gender is redefined as identity and not as oppression. Sorry. These changes took place between the 1995 World Conference on Women in Beijing and its action plan against discrimination and violence against women, and the 2007 meeting that set up the so-called Yogyakarta Principles that expanded the notion of gender identity and its introduction in legal and policy texts. And the media. The Yogyakarta Principles are set to promote the human rights of an oppressed community on the basis of their gender identity, sexual diversity, sexual orientation, and sexual expression, that is, the ever-expanding umbrella concept LGBTIQ+, although it refers to completely different people, realities, and needs. These principles are often wrongly presented as if they were legally binding for states as part of international law, something that has been done by the current government that we had in Spain. So, ideas and proposals from a world conference promoted by the United Nations of Women, a public international organization, were replaced by ideas and proposals from a private meeting promoted and financed by the Arcus Foundation, an important corporation related to transhumanism, biotechnology, and genetic engineering. Spanish legislation clearly reflects this contradiction in the meaning of gender. In March 2007, the Equality Act was passed, where gender is understood as oppression, but also the first Gender Recognition Act was passed, that is, the change in the legal sex of people under certain medical and legal conditions, where gender was defined for the first time as identity in a legal text in Spain. All regional and state laws passed since then have incorporated the Latin meaning to the detriment of the former. For example, all the trans protocols in education that were passed in regional parliaments without any public debate from 2014 onwards. In these protocols, sorry, here. In these protocols, to training materials, workshops for students and families, and increasingly in textbooks, we find anti-scientific ideas such as you can be born in the wrong body, nobody knows who the you is, sex is a spectrum, the human species is not binary, you can change sex, sex is wrongly attributed just by looking at the genitals, sexual orientation is like gender identity, or it is according to preferences in games, clothes, and friendships that we know whether a child is a boy or a girl. For example, in these toys that you see in the picture, for early childhood education, where the idea is that there is no such difference between a big clitoris and a small penis. Teachers are being taught this. We also find other activities explore and find one's true gender identity from age 3 onwards, like the ones you have on the slide. Sex of women and girls is replaced by expressions such as people with a vagina, people who menstruate, etc., that is also unbelievably promoted by the left. You can see one high school, a picture of one of these inclusive menstruating bathrooms that got an award by the Barcelona Council a couple of years ago. Segregated safe spaces for girls, like toilets, are regarded as exclusionary, and some are renamed, as I said, as menstrual bathrooms, like the one that obtained the award. Co-education is no longer a question of overcoming androcentrism in the curriculum, in schools, or educating to prevent violence against women, but of preventing LGBTIQ+ phobia and ensuring the right to be who you truly are. Last February, a new Gender Recognition Act was passed that no longer considers gender identity as a medical legal fiction based on dysphoria for a small number of people, typically adult men with serious gender dysphoria, but as acknowledging the trans reality without age limitations and the right to modify the body, a healthy body, with puberty blockers, hormones, and surgery to adapt it to the felt identity, expanding the nationwide regulations that were already had already been passed in regional parliaments in many regions. However, well, this is another example of the kind of mix-up. Okay. However, reality is stubborn. In the last months, more and more research reports on sexual violence and porn consumption among youngsters have already become part of the news, confirming the teachers' perceptions. They are often related to the effects of school lockdown periods of the COVID-19 pandemic, which exponentially increased both the youngsters' isolation and their exposure to the internet. In the two public hospitals of reference with emergency services for sexual aggressions in Barcelona, the one for population over 16, they treated 30% more cases in 2022 and 41% more cases in 2023, where 90% of victims were females, or increasingly younger ages, between 16 and 25, and 100% of perpetrators were males, 52% of whom were below 25. For that attends population under 16, they treated 45% more cases in 2021, where 87% of victims were girls, 13% were boys. 100% again of perpetrators were males, 32% of them below 18, and when they were not relatives, 42% of them were peers, usually classmates or well-known peers. Female victims were 42% between 13 and 16, 34% between 8 and 12, and 23% below 7. New forms of sexual violence are also growing among minors, where most of the victims are girls. Gang rape and cyber violence, such as sexting, sextortion, happy slapping, and then grooming. Gang rape has increased by 56% between 2016 and 2021. 1 in every 4 cases involves underage male perpetrators, replicating porn gangbang, where one woman is raped by several men at once. And recording and sharing online among peers has become popular. But, and this is going to be very controversial and is based on this report that is unique in Spain. What else has been growing exponentially in the last few years? Results from our report on changes in the demographic pattern of referrals to the Public Gender Identity Service in Catalonia in the last 10 years are compelling. There has been an exponential increase of over 7,000% in 10 years. New cases per year have quadrupled between 2016 and 2021, and those in 2021 alone already account for 25% of cases in the 10 years analyzed. You can identify what years they refer to and what was happening with the lockdowns. The average age has fallen. The service is increasingly dealing with women and minors, with a clearly different age pattern between girls and boys. Among minors aged from 0 to 9, boys predominate, but in the 10 to 14 and in the 15 to 25 age groups, girls predominate. The increase is alarming among pre-adolescent and adolescent girls. 70% of new cases in the 10 to 14 and the 15 to 18 age groups are girls. Although the increase is also alarming in the case of boys, between 2015 and 2021 alone, there was 5,700% increase in girls aged 10 to 14. Replacing sex by gender identity and its dissociation of self and body, separating sex characteristics and body functions from the self, has two consequences. Actual victims and perpetrators of violence are hidden. Therefore, violence based on sex cannot be understood or conceptually dismantled as the first step to its eradication. And increasing numbers of girls find a powerful and trendy narrative to run away from hypersexualization and sexual violence by rejecting to become women. This specifically includes lesbian girls, to a lesser extent, this happens to gay boys too, who are reinterpreting their sexual orientation through heterosexual norms and sexist stereotypes promoted by queer ideas and trans activism of what makes a woman and what makes a man. So far from providing a progressive and more effective way of struggling against sex-based violence, blurring and ultimately erasing sex increases misogyny and homophobia. My final remark, wait a minute, please. My final remark is that, once more, facts confirm what the great French anthropologist Françoise Héritier remarked in her works. Gender violence does not respond to any natural ferocity of men, but rather to a surplus of culture, of patriarchal culture that has to be learned. The reproduction of patriarchy takes place by subjecting boys to an accurate, all-encompassing learning of violence against women and girls and its naturalization. In contemporary culture, the disappearance of sex and the erasure of women and girls in the education against sex-based violence is in itself the ultimate and acceptable form of violence against them, against us. In the meanwhile, the Istanbul Convention has not redefined gender. It's still a legal text of reference, which cannot be changed so easily, but has given in to the pressure of gender identity activists and has redefined women on its website, speaking of, as you can see, safety and empowerment for all women and girls in all their diversity, regardless of whether they were born women. The United Nations has done exactly the same. But it is impossible to protect the targets of structural male violence if the very reason they are such, their sex, is made to disappear. Identities are not being sexually harassed, raped, and murdered, but women and girls are, and educators should be able to teach about it honestly with the feminist tools we already had. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. Can you remove your slides?
Yeah.
Thank you. And we're going a little bit over, but that's okay. We'll truncate the Q&A to some degree, though there are a couple of really interesting questions, especially interesting questions in the chat. I'd like to now turn to Carol Hooven for some comments. Carol, please.
Thank you. I'm going to go quickly because I want to make sure we get to the Q&A. So I'm just going to try to summarize some of the common themes here. What I'm hearing from our excellent speakers is that sex is real, sex is binary, and sex is important. It's important in general, and it's particularly important for feminism, important for women. And the denial of the existence of a sex-based biological reproductive category that is female, and then another one for male, is an anti-feminist idea. And each of our speakers provided evidence about why the acknowledgement of these realities is important for anthropology, is important for women, and they provided different reasons for this. So I'm not going to make the make the argument right now for the fact that sex is real and binary, but it's clear, obviously, in non-human animals, and humans are mammals, and we combine our gametes to reproduce. And I want to make sure, I think a really important point is that these facts that sex is real and binary do not detract and should not detract in any way from understanding and supporting the rights and existence of people who are gender minorities or identify in ways that are not necessarily consistent with their sex. And we can talk about sex, which is binary, and everything else associated with sex, which is not binary. These are sex-associated traits which have to do with social roles, how somebody feels, how somebody presents themselves. All of those traits are on a spectrum. And I think every one of the speakers, and I think most of the people in the audience, I hope, would agree that understanding the reality of sex actually improves our ability to promote human flourishing for everyone, including gender minorities. And I just want to summarize some of the ways that the speakers described the importance of sex for anthropology. And I won't go into detail here, just to, again, leave more time for questions. Sex matters for bones, and bones matter for a lot of different reasons, and skeletons are the bones of people who are male or female, and we can learn a lot from understanding how people in our past lived and how people are living and dying today. Narratives of our past. We are a sexed species that have sex roles, and if we deny the reality of sex, we have a lot of trouble understanding how we have come to be who we are today. Sex shapes technology. And I learned a lot from that talk and was introduced to ways of thinking about technology and the importance of sex for technology that I'd never considered, including robots and social media. That's something I have some experience on, and many of us do. Women cannot generally discuss openly issues related to sex and sex-based spaces. There are some problems doing that with accusations of transphobia, et cetera. Another area that is incredibly important is being able to collect data on the generally underrepresentation of women in various fields, especially in various sectors of industry and certain fields in academia. And if we can definitely collect data on identity, but it's also essential that we collect data on actual sex differences. So I think another really important point is the protection of girls and women and safe spaces. And I don't mean safe spaces where we're free from offense. I mean safe spaces where girls and women, because of our sex, which makes us smaller and weaker than men on average, we actually do need protection from physical violence, from sexual violence, in a way that is a greater need than for most males. And I think that's incredibly important. And we lose that when we deny the reality of sex. So I saw a comment when I was just looking at the comments during the talks that it was, I see transphobic and intersex phobia is real on this panel. And I just think that this is not rational. That I personally don't see that. I see people who are trying to understand reality and are compassionate. And I don't see any tension between being a caring, compassionate person who cares about gender diversity and trans issues and intersex issues, and people who acknowledge the reality of sex. In fact, I think it's essential to acknowledge the reality of sex in order to support those groups. So I just want to advocate for letting people air their views and have open discussions. And thank you, Heterodox Academy, for allowing us to do this. And I think now we should go to questions.
Thank you, Carol. That's really helpful. And thanks to everyone in the audience. We're running a little bit late, and I'm going to pull an audible and do the Q&A in a slightly different way. I'm going to pick one question, which I've already chosen from the Q&A questions. And I'm going to go through the panelists and invite each of you to make a few comments about that question or about another topic that you wanted to say, another statement on this issue and about the issue about the panel being canceled that you want to bring up. So I'll read out the question from the chat. And again, you're free to speak directly to the question. I think it's a wonderful question, or to speak about your experience on this panel being canceled. I'm going to ask each of you to be very brief. We're coming up on 6 o'clock. I'd love to have us actually end at 6:05 because we have a certain deal with our audience. We won't keep them later. So I'll read the question and then ask you to reply very briefly to the question, or just any comments you briefly want to make. And the question I'm going to read is one that I noticed when it came in. I thought it was a wonderful question, and I was really happy to see it get upvoted to the very top. So I'm going to read this question at the very top on the Q&A. And the question is from Avalon Paradea. And here's the question. The question's in two parts. As a trans person with a background in paleoanthropology and physical anthropology, I have never encountered anyone who seriously pushed back against the general concept of a sexual binary. And now there are two questions. Are there large-scale groups within the sciences who are denying the usefulness of the sex binary? And the second question is, why is the topic of this talk deemed important to the speakers? What is it about this talk and this panel that's important to you? And you can answer that question either way that you like. I'm just going to go through the list and ask you again just to be very brief in your responses. Kathleen Lowry, would you mind beginning?
Yeah, I actually find this question puzzling because I think if this is an issue you've been following, have you seriously not come across? There are multiple publications challenging the idea that sex is binary, suggesting that it's bimodal, suggesting that it's a spectrum. And this has implications both for scientific research and specifically for women's rights. So I mean, if Avalon is puzzled, I'm happy to send Avalon some references. But yes, there is a large scale organized attempt to say that sex is not binary, that it's either bimodal or a spectrum. And there are real concerns about this, both from feminists and from scientists who work more in kind of biological evolutionary anthropology. And that's who's come together on this panel. So that's it from me. Thanks.
Thank you, Kathleen. I'll remind you, you can respond directly to the question if you like, or you can take this opportunity to make a comment about the issue or the panel, any part of your experience. Elizabeth Weiss, next, please.
Yeah, I have seen quite a few articles on the issue of sex not being binary on the skeleton. Much of this is about archaeology, but there's even a movement to not identify sex of crime victims if a body is found, or if even if it's just a skeleton's found. I think that my concern is not so much that whether we agree or disagree about whether gender is, how significant gender is in a sense, but rather that we realize that there are two concepts here, that there's sex, which is biological, and binary is really important to still keep in mind, especially when looking at the skeletal remains, whether we're doing reconstructions of the past or forensics. And I would actually think that for forensics, and also about medical anthropology that we do want to consider about these very recent developments of gender and the trans issue, and how we can best serve all people. So I think that this is a very tricky time, but we cannot ignore the fact that sex is still very important to help. It's a category to help people.
Thanks. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Elizabeth. Kathleen Richardson, please.
Yeah, just thank you again for this evening. It's been really good, and I hope that people have enjoyed it. And this is the kind of conversation I think we need to be, and I think we need people to be speaking about what's really happening rather than avoiding conversations, which has been going on for a long time. When this issue came to light a few years ago, I remember, because I was quite on board with anyone having any idea about their own subjectivity, which is very typical in anthropology. People have different viewpoints and different ideas about themselves. But then I noticed that in order to be on board with trans ideology, I had to believe that men who identify as women were actually women, and that sex didn't matter. And then I had to believe a number of other things, like they were born in the wrong body and everything else. And over time, I've just realized that being transphobic means anyone who disagrees with anyone who believes in trans ideology. So for me, it's become less, people do have the right to their own subjectivity, and people shouldn't experience violence. But I think what's really happening is a real restriction of conversation around this issue, which is very, very harmful to women and children. And so this is a good place to start that conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. I just remind you each all, please be very brief. Michelle Surwa. Michelle, please speak in French if you like.
Okay. Because erasing sex means erasing women, and men too. This is dangerous to women, as they need protected spaces, the right to meet, the right to compete equally between themselves, etc. Merci.
Thank you. And you did it in rhyming pentameter as well in English. It's very impressive. Thank you. Sylvia, you may speak in Spanish or English or Catalan, any language you like. Oh, but if you rhyme your scheme, Sylvia, please.
Not necessary.
You needn't rhyme. You needn't rhyme.
I usually speak English, so maybe the question was written before my presentation, because in case it was written after my presentation, I don't understand the question.
It was written early. The question came up early, and it's a person asking about the state of sex.
So after my presentation, I think it becomes clear that we cannot ignore the basis of oppression against women and girls. So if we erase sex, we are denying the power, little power that is practiced, not little, but lethal power that is practiced on women and girls under patriarchy. But even more, what I try to say is that while neoliberal markets are recruiting boys to consume women and girls, and this gives way to increasing numbers of cases of violence, of sexual aggression, etc., teachers and the society at large is denied the tools to effectively even talk about it. So I think it's absolutely clear. That's one thing. And the second one is that I subscribe what Kathleen Laurie said at the beginning. So in the academia, it's clear that we cannot speak about these issues in the terms we have been able to do it tonight. So this is incredible. We're living in a censorship. This is unbearable. It's the death of social science if we cannot ask questions. And I don't believe there exist any trans children and youth at all. And I have the right to say this. I have the right to say this and to research on this, not being accused of transphobia. And finally, I'm a materialist because I work on inequalities and I need to see who is experiencing inequalities. So I don't ascribe to interpretive paradigms that I think have been proved a failure in anthropology. I prefer to adhere to socio-critical paradigms. So that's my answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. Carol, would you like a final word?
Sure. I just got an email today, and I don't want to reveal who sent it to me, but credit goes out to that person, from a quote from the Journal of Obesity Research and Clinical Practice. I just happened to get this today. This is not a surprise. This is what is happening in science. There is a note to people who are submitting articles about the definitions of sex and gender. Again, this is a well-respected medical journal, the Journal of Obesity Research and Clinical Practice. Sex and gender are often incorrectly portrayed as binary, female/male or male/woman, and unchanging, whereas these constructs actually exist along a spectrum and include additional sex categorizations and gender identities, such as people who are intersex/ have differences of sex development or identify as non-binary. Moreover, the term sex and gender can be ambiguous. That's blah, blah, blah. So this is just one example of what is going on in the sciences, and people like me can get into, and I was in an evolutionary biology department at Harvard, can get into quite a bit of trouble for asserting, especially publicly, that sex is immutable and only comes in male and female. So it's very real.
Thank you. I'd like to close by thanking everyone in the audience for tuning into this event. At points, there are over 400 people watching the event. That's an important thing, the fact that each of you individually made the choice to take some time to join this conversation, to support this event, and to support these panelists. So I just want to really thank each of you for signing on and for being part of us. To the panelists, I just want to say that, I mean, at the very beginning of this event, I stated that I felt that the AAU and HxA were wrong to cancel this panel. That's something that I said. But what you did over the last 2 hours, I think, was to show why they were so wrong to cancel this panel. You showed by your evident intellect, your evident concern for these issues, showing the significance of these topics and these conversations that we so desperately need to have. You showed why they made a mistake of canceling this panel. So again, to you, I just want to really thank you and just respect so much to each of you for the work you do and for the bravery that you show. I'm going to end this event now. For those of you who don't follow HxA, please look us up, follow us online. We're going to be having our annual conference in Chicago next summer. I hope that many of you will join us. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Bye all.